So now that we have a basic understanding of HTML and CSS, it's time to learn JavaScript. JavaScript is a programming language originally created to script web pages, but over the last 2 decades, it's come to do much more. JavaScript is what allows you to have dynamic interactions take place with your website or application. When a user clicks a button on your website and the website responds, you're watching JavaScript in action. It can be used not just for web pages, but more intensive interactive applications like video games. Now, the first thing we need to know before going over the language is how to add it to your HTML pages. There are 2 primary ways to add JavaScript to your page. One is using the script tags, which look like this. All JavaScript code would then get placed in between these script tags. The other way is to reference an external JavaScript file. JavaScript files use the .js extension, and it looks like this. You can reference a JavaScript file from an HTML file by placing a script tag in between the head elements like this. Here you'll need to specify the type, which is text/JavaScript, and then you need to specify the directory of the file, which gets placed after the src attribute. So now that we're done with this, let's get on to primitive data types. In programming, there exist what are called data types. In JavaScript, there exist 6 data types. All 6 data types are as follows: number, string, boolean, null, undefined, and object. In this tutorial, we're going to discuss the first 5 data types, which are the primitive data types. Objects are a data type, but they are not a primitive data type. So objects will not be discussed until later tutorials. So for now, we're only going to concern ourselves with the other 5 types. Along with the primitive data types, we will also discuss variable assignment. So what are variables? A variable is a word or a collection of keyboard characters used to store data. So let me repeat that. Variables are used to store data. If you look at the screen, I have a variable titled valueAmount. However, this variable is empty. Let's use it to store some data by assigning it a number. Now our variable has the number 100 assigned to it. This was done by using this operator. In JavaScript and programming languages in general, this is not an equal sign. Let me repeat that. This does not mean equal to. It is used to express assignment, and it's called the assignment operator. If you notice, the variable also begins with the var statement. This is needed when creating a variable, and it's referred to as declaring the variable. You declare variables with the var statement. You can declare empty variables or variables with data assigned to them. You must then end your variable declaration with a semicolon. So in total, there are 5 parts of a variable declaration. There's the var statement, the name of the variable, the assignment operator, the assigned value, and the ending semicolon. If we were to print out our variable to the screen, it would print out the number 100. One of the ways that we can print data to the screen is by using a method called document.write, and then placing the variable inside of it. We can then launch the web browser and see the variable value. You can also achieve a similar output by using another method called console.log, which looks like this. With this method, you can output data to the browser console. In Chrome, you'll need to right-click and choose Inspect Element, and then click Console to see the output. Now, if you look at our variable, you probably notice that it's written in a peculiar manner. So there's a few things going on here. First, the first letter is lowercase. This is because it's considered bad practice to have variables that begin with uppercase. Also, there's no empty spaces between characters. This is because white space, which is empty space, is not used for variable names. So one of the ways to connect multiple words in your variables is to make every word's first letter uppercase, not including the first letter of the variable itself. This is called camel case. Another data type we can assign to variables are called strings. Strings are basically a collection of characters that are expressed in quotation marks. In other words, strings are words contained within quotation mark characters. Displayed on the screen, I have a few examples of strings and non-strings. The first example is a string because the characters are in quotation marks. The second example is also a string, although it may look a bit odd and overextended. The third example is not a string because the word assigned to it is not in quotation marks. The fourth example isn't a string because it's a number. The fifth example is a string because even though it's a number, it's inside of quotation marks. The last example is a string, and this one demonstrates that you can have strings with white space, which is empty space between characters. In short, any characters in quotation marks are strings. One thing that you probably noticed is how I use front slash characters to explain the code that I wrote. This is the format by which you write comments in JavaScript. Comments are used to create notes for humans to read, not the computer. You can write single-line comments or multi-line comments using this format. You've had a glance at the number data type, but there are a few more things you need to know. In programming, there are two main types of numbers that you should be aware of. One is called int, which is short for integer, and the other is called float, which is short for floating point. Ints are simply whole numbers without a decimal point. Floats, on the other hand, are numbers with a decimal point. Many programming languages categorize floats and ints as two different data types. JavaScript, on the other hand, categorizes them both as the same data type, which is number. The next data type we're going to go over is undefined. Undefined simply means that a variable is undefined or non-existent. Here's an example. This is an undefined variable. You can see this in action by using the document.write function. If you type this code into your text editor and then launch your web browser, the output will be undefined. After typing this code, you should understand that using type of before a variable will output its data type. If the variable is empty, you will see undefined as the output. If you remove this variable declaration altogether, the output will still be undefined. Null is a primitive data type that must be first assigned to a variable to be used. The purpose of null is to express that a variable exists, but that it is not assigned to anything. If you attempt to use type of on a variable assigned to null, you will notice that the output will be object. You just discovered one of the many quirks of the JavaScript programming language. Technically, null is its own type, but irrespective of this, type of outputs object. There are two values that belong under the boolean data type, and they are true and false, and there's nothing more to it than that. But keep in mind that true and false are reserved words in JavaScript, and that means you can only use them for what they're intended to be used for, which is the boolean data type. Here's an example. Always make sure you don't add quotation marks to true or false. Otherwise, they'll become strings. And in our example, you can make the variable false if you like. Now, before we finish up this tutorial, I want to mention two things. The first is in regard to declaring variables. Now, technically, in JavaScript, you don't need to preface your variables with the var statement, and the browser will still run the code. But this is considered very bad practice to do. The reasons for this will be explained in future tutorials. But for now, simply assume that it's always necessary to add the var statement to the beginning of your variables. The other thing I want to mention is that technically all numbers in JavaScript are floats. Ints in JavaScript are actually floating point numbers. But for the sake of explaining the number type without confusion, I omitted this information. In future tutorials, the issue will be revisited and clarified. So that about wraps it up for this tutorial. Until next time, bye-bye.